I've been to many different kinds of churches where they have different kinds of preaching styles. So, just to give some examples, I went to a church, many churches. This is probably how most churches in America preach, actually. And it's what you would probably call topically. Now, there can be topical and expository at the same time preaching, I think. But you typically topically, what happens is the pastor just comes up with whatever verse he wants to talk about that week, and he picks a verse, or he picks multiple verses from a bunch of different places, and he uses that to support his personal argument that he's trying to get across. And I think that can be kind of dangerous, this idea of topical, not expository. So expository preaching, what that is, I've talked about this in previous episodes, is taking a passage and seeing what the passage says and applying that passage. So it's passage based. But if we do this other tactic of preaching topically in this way, what you can do is you could say, like, I have this crazy opinion and I just want to pick verses from here and here and here and here to formulate an argument that supports my point. And that's very dangerous, because you could say just about anything and take any verse or take many verses from anywhere in the Bible, totally disconnected, out of context, and use that to prove your point. And I think that's what a lot of pastors do today. That's how a lot of them preach. And particularly, it's how the ones preach where the churches have, for example, churches that wave pride flags. They will take verses out of context and they'll say, look, this is why homosexuality isn't actually an abomination. That's a bad way to preach. So hopefully we're on the same page about that. The second way to preach, and this is actually, I went to these churches in this order. The next church I went to, so I didn't like that style of preaching whatsoever, but the next church I went to was focused on Scripture. They preached expositorily, or expositionally is another word for it, where they would read a larger passage of text. Usually they would go through an entire book of the Bible, like the book of Acts, for example. And one week they would take a chapter, or they would take a handful of verses, and they would go through it. They would explain what it meant, and the sermon would be over. They would kind of teach you what the passages say, and that's it. They wouldn't do a lot of application, and I think they did this on purpose, because they, like my friend was arguing, they didn't want to get away from Scripture, which, again, like I said earlier, kind of sounds like a good thing. It sounds like you have your heart in the right place. But let me tell you about the third kind of church first. The issue with the second kind of church was that there wasn't a lot of application, and the application that they did offer usually amounted to something like, they could give any passage and they would say, therefore, our pastoral charge is believe in Jesus. And, there is something to be said about being able to tie any passage in the Bible into the gospel and to Jesus Christ, because he is the center of our faith. But that's all they would do. So technically, even that church that he went to was getting away from what Scripture said word for word. And I'll get into that in a second. But the third type of church is the church that preaches expositorily. And it's the church that takes passages of text, or a single passage, or, whatever. And you, instead of using them to support your argument, you are actually creating an argument from Scripture to, one, explain what it means, and two, apply it to the congregation. And so I think these last two options that I've given you, the church that applies the text and the church that doesn't apply the text, are the main two that I want to discuss and kind of weigh the options for. I think the potential risk of the third kind of church, the church that I think is best, the church that applies the text to the congregation, there is a risk involved. And that risk is, if they are carrying the text places, they could maybe lose some along the way, or they could carry it to the wrong place. They could get away from Scripture in a way that's bad. they could apply scripture in a good way, but they could also apply scripture in a bad way. Kind of like the church in the first scenario, where maybe you are taking even a larger passage of text. I think it's much harder to do this when you're using larger passages of text because you're reading it actually in context, which is good, which is something that actually defends from this kind of thing happening. But I think there's still a risk anyway of that happening here, where you're taking a passage and you want to apply it to the lives of your congregation, who wasn't the original audience of the passage that you're reading.